Well, hello, this is Dr. B. I'm your nerdy criminal justice professor. And with me today is Dr. Patrick McMunn. And I won't call him the nerdy psychology professor. I'll just say he's a psychology
There you go.
professor. But anyway, we are both professors at Glenville State University. And we're going to talk a little bit about psychological drives and defense mechanisms related to criminal profiling. So, Patrick, what I'd like to do is just kind of set up just a little bit of a scenario
Mhm.
and ask you just to kind of think out loud about this
Okay.
with us. Um, so, when we think about sex offenders, there are those who are opportunistic. Um, it might be someone, it's likely someone that they know. But then there are serial rapists
Mm.
who will break into homes. They will assault people on the street, pull them into an alley or someplace like that.
Mhm.
And they tend to commit a lot of crimes. And that's a little different than, say, a family member who takes advantage of a situation. So
Right.
when we think about the serial rapist, and you think about psychological drives, what would you think drives a person psychologically to do that?
Well, I mean, and I'm sure you've encountered this a lot in your field of study is antisocial personality traits and personality disorder, APD. Oftentimes, people that engage in repeated abuse of other people and violations of their of their rights and their well-being. Oftentimes, there's that lack of remorse, right? They might be exacting. There could be multiple reasons, but I think probably the more famous one is just that harming other people for the sake of harming them because it brings joy to them. That would probably be fall in line with a little bit more of the serial offenders, I think, wouldn't you say?
Okay. So if Sigmund Freud were with us today, what do you think he would say developed that desire to take advantage of other folks like that?
Well, I mean, there's the famous one because with defense mechanisms and how they show up in the criminal world. I mean, you have your big five. You have the denial, you have the projection, you have the rationalization. What's the other? The repression and displacement. Right. I would say probably the number one self-defense mechanism that shows up in any criminal behavior is that rationalization part, right? They're justifying means to harm somebody else to reduce their own internal guilt and protect their ego.
Okay. Um, for many of them, they're non-sexual ways of harming other people.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's taking advantage of someone financially, um, um, maybe bullying. Um, what help us kind of walk us through, just from your understanding, what might l- lead to choosing sex as the way to express that rather than, say, fraud?
Okay, so being more exacting on maybe something that they've encountered in their life, possibly. Like maybe a trauma that would fall under I would say either probably both projection and displacement. By displacement is when they're redirecting their emotions to safer targets, less threatening ones that can push back or fight back. Because if a good way to think about it, and I think everybody can probably relate to this in some fashion, is if you maybe go to work or go to school and you have a maybe a professor or a teacher or somebody that was mean to them or gave them a bad grade on their paper or bad performance evaluation, we don't feel safe uh, expressing our hurt and our pain to that object, to that person. And what oftentimes happens if we don't have those communication skills in place and we don't have the self-confidence to confront what it is that caused us that pain, we oftentimes displace that, and it manifests in oftentimes in aggression, which I think you mentioned bullying earlier. I mean, displacement is probably one of the bigger drives of bullying.
Okay, so let's so displacement, I want to make sure I'm hearing this right. Displacement is where my feelings of aggression are really towards the person who harmed me, but I'm taking them out on someone else.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. A way to regain power from something. For example, and kind of going along the lines of the bullying, somebody that's afraid of their father, and instead they might well, I guess that's more projection. Might fear another male, right? I mean, that's also projection. But anyway, if they're able to find a softer target, something that's not going to fight back or harm them in some way or reject them in some way. That's a big one. They would exact that revenge on them and that reclaim of power.
Okay. So projection then would be I see this person as being my father, so I'm doing it. Whereas displacement would be my father did this to me, so I'm going to find other people to do it to.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that a good way of saying it?
Yeah, I think so. That's a really good. And I see that a lot in helping professions or law enforcement, even. I do see that a lot in law enforcement, where you have a law enforcement officer that has, even though they're in a safe neighborhood, they're setting up their house with all the fancy home intrusion devices and cameras and everything because they see the world as an unsafe place and they're projecting that upon their family and their place of safe haven.
Okay. I was unsafe, so my family's unsafe. Okay. So we've talked about just now projection displacement. So let's pick one of the other three that of the defense mechanisms of the big five that you'd like to go next. Which one do you which is the next one for us to talk about, you think?
Well, I think you would probably see, and going back to the serial offenders and recidivists, would be denial, right? And that's refusal to accept the reality. That oftentimes hinders self-reflection and accountability. So oftentimes people that commit crimes, they rationalized it. They're in denial of having committed that or that they've done any wrongdoing. So that kind of goes hand in hand with rationalization. But denial is definitely the higher form. And that can be limiting. I mean, you can pretty easily overcome rationalization by seeing somebody else's point of view, but denial takes a lot of work, a pretty good amount of work to overcome.
Okay. Um, do they deny their own emotions that lead them to to this need to harm others?
They could, especially if it's wrapped up in rationalization. I mean, if they're denying, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying are they denying that they feel bad about it or that they could feel bad about it?
Or they're denying just the underlying emotions that give them this urge to commit these crimes.
Um, maybe. I mean, I think that might fall under the guise of repression, which is blocking painful memories and
Okay.
to that lead to unresolved trauma. So they might be suppressing or repressing some of those emotions. But yeah, denial, if you look at the stages of motivation, I don't know if you're familiar with Prochaska's levels of
Yes.
motivation. Yeah, pre-contemplation. Oftentimes you see blame and denial in that realm where they know that something's happening to them. They may be incarcerated. They may have legal issues and maybe their kids have been taken away and they really don't quite understand how their decisions led to that. So they might blame others. They might blame the system. They'll blame everything but them. That's where we usually see denial. So that's they may feel a certain way. They may feel like the world has come down on them and they've endured a significant amount of loss, but they just haven't accepted that their own accountability. Their actions led to those consequences.
Okay. Yeah. So for me, is Prochaska's pre-contemplation stage is like saying, okay, I've got problems, but they're not my problems. It's everybody else. If
Yep.
everybody else would get in line, I wouldn't have any problems. It's your fault that I've got problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that would that fit with your understanding of Prochaska's
It is. Yep, yep.
pre-contemplation? Yeah.
I think it's part of that definition of pre-contemplation is blame and denial. And
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. It's very much an external locus of control. If I've got problems in my life, it's outside of me. It's not inside of me.
Yeah. It's everybody else's problem but mine, but I'm here. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem affects me, but I'm not the one that's causing it. Yep.
Now, you work with prison populations, right?
Oh yeah.
Do you ever see, I would imagine you do, like what stages, like going along that denial, what stages do you usually see with those motivations and how does that show up? I'm curious.
Uh, and quite frankly, most of the prison and jail population are in pre-contemplation. Um, but I find that, especially in the prison where they're there more long term and have time to think about what they're there for because they've already been convicted at that point. In the jail, very few of them have been convicted and are just waiting for a bed. But in the prison, it seems like for a long time they'll go back and forth between pre-contemplation and contemplation.
Mhm.
Uh, and yeah, Prochaska, when we look at it, it's we tend to teach it in a very linear fashion. You go from one to the next,
Mm.
and not realizing that you might go to the next stage and then kind of take some steps back and and revert back to an earlier, and then you might make it to preparation, and then you kind of revert back. Um, and at the end of the whole thing, and this is what I used to tell the addicts, is that when you finally get to I can never remember the name of the last stage,
Maintenance.
maintenance. Thank you. When you get to the maintenance stage of being in recovery, the maintenance stage of being in recovery is the pre-contemplation stage of a relapse.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. No.
So yeah, so you have to constantly realize you're in pre-contemplation stage of a relapse
Mhm.
if you don't keep your maintenance plan going. So um, because the stages of change work in the positive and negative directions.
Mhm.
Any
Absolutely.
change we're making, whether we're making a good one or a bad one, we kind
Yeah.
of go through that. It really is kind of global. But anyway, so you mentioned rationalization.
Hmm.
So, what are some rationalizations do you think that um, we might hear from a serial offender, like a serial rapist or even a serial killer? What might be some of the rationalizations?
Uh, well, I mean, that's a tricky one with serial killers. I mean, we've we've done our best to study them, but I don't know as though we really know them, right? Because
Mhm.
they have a whole other level of not only what we call anti, well, it's part of their diagnosis, antisocial versus prosocial. They lack that component of prosocial, which is biologically something that's hardwired into us to get along with others because we value others, right? Humans are a pack animal. We recognize the strengths of being in a collective so that we can thrive as a society. People that, and we do know this of serial killers, they lack that pro-social component, which by definition, they act out antisocially. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with they don't feel like hanging out with people. It's actually opposite of pro-social, where they intend to do harm for people because it benefits them in some way. And with serial killers, it can be either a gratification, right? They're hurting people because it feels good, it gives them that thrill, or that they just don't realize that they're hurting other people, but they want to get some kind of monetary value or gain or property or whatever. You kind of
Yeah.
fill in the blank. So I think more of the sociopathic tendencies would be they get enjoyment from it. They get an actual gratification from hurting people or harming people. But the rationalization in there, and you can kind of see that in any crime. For example, if there aren't enough social programs in place to give people give a mother money for to feed her kids, she might rationalize, well, I know this is a crime, but I'm going to go out and do that anyway to steal or shoplift and commit that crime because she's rationalized it. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. How serial killers or serial rapists would rationalize that. I think they just act on impulse and self gratification, and I don't know if they as though they feel like they need to take accountability for breaking laws because laws don't really keep them. It's not really a guide rail to keep them on the straight and narrow, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you bring up an interesting point. One of the things that I've tried to help the class get an understanding of is that back in the 70s, when John Douglas and some of the other folks with the FBI were doing quote research to help them learn how to develop profiles, they would go into prisons and interview serial rapists and serial killers. And I believe they interviewed something like 30 or 40 people.
Hmm.
Well, the estimates are right now that there are over, I know it's well over 500 serial killers operating in the United States
Hmm.
currently, though we don't know their identities.
Hmm.
And I'm sure that the number of serial rapists is probably close to that. Now, compared to our population, those are very small numbers. I get that. Um, but when you look at um, no more than 40 to 50 people, and you simply take them at their word and you know them to have a personal agenda, a private agenda. They get their jollies out of hurting people. They get their jollies out of lying to people, and
Hmm.
you just take them at face value. I think that creates um, a result from of research that can't be trusted.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I
So
heard somewhere, I think US is up there as far as serial killers too, right? I think we're
yes,
United States lead the country by far for
yeah, yeah,
serial.
yeah. We lead the world by known by 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 knowing how many serial killers are out there operating. Now,
Yeah.
there could be more in other countries that they, especially in Europe, if they go from one country to the next, those countries might not be putting DNA in the same databases that talk to each other. So there could be more in Europe going around from country to country. But knowing that we've got so many operating in the US and we just don't know who they are,
Mm.
we tend to top the world in those numbers. Um, but so criminal profilers try to create a psychological profile,
Mm.
and they base it on a lot of Freudian and just more globally psychodynamic principles.
Mm.
Um, but they haven't really done any kind of work to validate what they're doing. So, but I wanted the students to have an understanding of things like the psychological drives and the defense mechanisms, so that
Mm.
they could at least know some of the foundation that the profilers are operating on.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think that's a good way to look at it, especially maybe not necessarily for serial killers and serial rapists, but the people that have exacted, that maybe have had trauma in their life. We do know the studies have shown that children who endure abuse perpetuate abuse, oftentimes, not always, have a
yeah,
tendency to perpetuate abuse later on in life.
yeah. One of the studies that a colleague of mine did back in the late 90s, early 2000s, um, and she used the polygraph to make sure they were telling the truth. Now, yeah, there are some issues with the polygraph, but it's better than nothing when you're doing research. And she found that adult male rapists were more likely to have witnessed their fathers beating their mothers than to have experienced sexual abuse themselves.
Okay.
So they weren't the victim of the violence, but they witnessed their mother being a victim of violence. And it wasn't necessarily, I mean, she didn't distinguish whether it was sexual violence in the domestic violence that was happening, or whether it was domestic violence without the sexual components. But so all we know is domestic violence. But they were more likely to have witnessed domestic violence
Mhm.
rather than have been a victim, a direct victim of sexual violence themselves. It was just an interesting finding. Now,
Yeah.
that was just one study, and I believe there were 30 people in that study.
Mhm.
Um, so, there's we can't generalize that, but it at least kind of piques my interest
Yeah.
to what do we really know about how violence gets translated from one generation to the next, or I should say transmitted rather.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Freud recognized some drives. I mean, he recognized the hunger drive,
Mhm.
he recognized the sex drive. What are some of the other drives that Freud recognized?
Yeah, hunger, need for, what was that? Need for affection, need for,
Uh,
that was.
okay, that yeah, I couldn't remember what the name of that was, but yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, some of those drives, and what he's referring to are those basic impulses, aggression. Like, for example, we learned that at a young age, and I guess this is probably a good segue to get into what Freud helped to or did coin was the idea, the concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. And what he suggested is that at a unconscious level, below the surface level, because we have these three levels. We have the unconscious, which is completely out of our awareness. So, and I'll go into examples in just a little bit. We have the preconscious level where we recognize that something is kind of going on, kind of like that pre-contemplation stage where we know something bad is happening to us, we just don't know why. That would be
right,
the pre-conscious level. Maybe we're feeling a little irritable, or we're having some symptoms, physiological symptoms of anxiety, but we don't have a test or anything coming up, and we just don't know why. That would be an example of a pre-conscious level. And then we have our conscious level, which occurs at our level of awareness. So we know that something is happening. Like we go outside and the sun's beating on our face, and we're thinking, "Oh, this is a nice day." We're aware of what's going on around us, and we're aware of how that's affecting us. From birth, we're taught how to react to our impulses. So if we're hungry, what do? We we cry, right? We feel the sensation in our stomach. We feel the hunger pangs, and we cry, right? That cry, if mom or our caregiver, usually mom, if our caregiver is not meeting those needs, we cry louder because the hunger pangs are getting even more. So we start learning to get big and loud until we get what we want, and that sets the stage for how we react to certain situations at from birth up to a couple months into a year or 2 years old. How do we get what we want? How do we communicate that? And how sure are we that we're going to receive that? So that develops the id. And as we get up a little bit later, so aggression comes from the id, sex impulse comes from the id, hunger comes from the id, and as we get a little bit older, a couple months into life, we start learning that there are rules, right? So that the lights go out, mom and dad probably aren't going to be feeding us, right? So
hmm
there's rules of the universe, and this starts to build the ego, which is what we know as it's the executive, I guess, mediator between our id impulse. And then I'll talk about superego in just a little bit. But anyway, it's our reality. This is the reality, but we're feeling this way. So anyway, that kind of takes over, and he is Freud goes through the psychosexual stages of development, which start off with oral. Anal is the next stage. That's the next rule that we experience, right? Is what? Potty training, right?
hmm
We can't really. go to the bathroom when we want to go to the bathroom, even though our stomach hurts and we or our bladder is full. We can't just go where we want to go. So there's our first one of our first lessons in developing reality. So anyway, we develop these rules as to how the world works versus what we want, and out of that, as we start to interact more with the world and develop relationships with people, the superego forms. And these are our sense of right and wrong. These are our sense of need for perfection versus letting things go. Oftentimes, we incorporate that from our parents and our peers.
Yes.
So that superego interacts with that id and between the id and the ego, and we start to figure out how we can achieve what we want in the world, balancing all three of those. Um, so I probably went off on a tangent with that, but
No,
anyway,
that's fine.
going to the impulse idea that's born out of the id. We know what we want. We know that we want sexual gratification. The reality is there's laws that we can't take what we want. However, with that superego, we're aware that of those two things, so it goes back and forth to determine, hey, can I justify this? Can I get away with this? Do I actually have a problem? Do I actually feel this pain? And that's where those self-defense mechanisms often start to take place.
Okay. Yeah. I remember when I was early in my training where we talked about sometimes we have the id and the super ego, and the ego mediates and keeps them balanced, but sometimes the ego doesn't work and they get out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the id is a lot stronger, and sometimes the superego is a lot stronger in some people.
Hmm.
And it sounds like for serial killers and serial rapists, the id might be in control, and the ego is not doing its job mediating.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Their
So
sense of how the world works is vastly skewed.
yes,
Yeah.
and we might think of someone like Mother Teresa having a very strong superego,
Hmm.
very
Yeah.
strong sense of of conscience,
Hmm.
very strong sense of right and wrong, and desire to do the right thing always. Um, Most of us have a really good ego that helps us realize we're not perfect,
Hmm.
but we try to be good people. So
Yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah,
and you brought up altruism. That's actually a defense mechanism. It's one of the adaptive defense mechanism that Freud helped to explain.
yeah,
And Mother
very
Teresa
good.
would be a great example of that.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're going just about 30 minutes right now, and I don't want to give the students more than a 30-minute video to watch. So, but anyway, I just want to say thank you, Pat, for
Yeah.
doing this with me. I know this was very off the cuff. I want to do it that way on purpose, so students don't be mad at him. Be mad at me if you didn't like it. Uh, he kept asking me, "What's the structure? What's your structure?" I said, "No, I want to be off the cuff."
I am structure oriented.
I know, I know. I used to be, but I've gotten to the point now where I like to see where things go.
Yeah, yeah.
New
Free
things can come out of
association.
that.
Freud's free association, right?
Yes, well, and new things and new stuff can come out of that.
Absolutely.
Our thought processes can go in directions we never thought they would. But anyway, so I just want to say thank you, Pat, and I hope the students have enjoyed this as much as I have.
I hope so.